or technical assistance and expect that you're going to transform a developmental environment. To go back to the question then, Bobby, which I hope we've resolved our technical issue. What do you think?
I really hope so. Please confirm.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. What do you think donors should be?
Thank you very much.
Confirming. What should donors be doing to support rights and local ownership in countries?
Thank you very much, first of all, for having me. I am very honored to be part of this conversation and part of this webinar. I want to, first of all, congratulate you, Dr. Greg Mills, for the accomplishment on that work, and to thank you for always writing, not only for leisure, not only for entertainment, but for good consumption and for development. It is hard in humanity to realize how important one's work is, but I want you to know that your work is very important. And I'm very honored to also feature somewhere on that amazing work. Looking at my name on the front page of that book, it's really humbling for me. Like I've said severally, what I bring on the table in the world discussion and in world, but particularly African politics, is the view of very many people, largely young people, but again also those excluded from the conversation, the ghetto people, the less privileged, the young men and women that are unemployed, those who happen to be the majority, not just in my country, Uganda, but the world. And I'm very glad that largely by my thoughts, which are not necessarily professional, but popular, I'm glad that these thoughts are represented in many important conversations like this very one. And also my brother Tendai, I send you salutations. I'm sure you will relate a great deal from what and Zimbabwe. We share the plight, we share the challenges of authoritarianism, of lawlessness, of disrespect to democracy. But again, we share aspirations as well. Now, we know that if Zambia did it, then we shall also did it. So I send you salutations. These are my thoughts on aid. First of all, and I'm glad, Greg, you mentioned it, that aid has been politicized. It's with the politics, not necessarily what it is proclaimed to be purposeful of. Otherwise, we wouldn't, the development partners wouldn't continue pouring aid where they know that it is not only ineffective or unhelpful, but detrimental to the people that they purport to be sending it to. In the context of Uganda, where I come from, we receive a very substantial, foreign aid portion. Our budget is largely funded by foreign aid. We are the second largest receivers of military aid from the United States in sub-Saharan Africa. We, continue to receive aid, but this aid comes from democracies, which democracies had to be strict and had to stand by their principles to ensure that they achieve the standard of life and therefore the standard of carrying themselves that they are on, but they continue to fund not the moral, political and social development, but this moral, social, and most importantly, political decay. And I'm very glad Comrade Tendai has mentioned it. I always give Uganda or Zimbabwe as live examples because the world can no longer pretend not to see what is happening in Zimbabwe since the days of Robert Mugabe. So when they deal with Zimbabwe, they are actually being partners in crime. The world cannot continue to pretend they don't see what is happening in Uganda. Maybe the oppressions, maybe the abuse of rights and the undermining of democracy in other countries is not as pronounced as it is in Uganda. But the world when the internet was shut off in Uganda, when General Museveni ordered blatantly for an on-street massacre, and young men and women and children were murdered, which I believe if it happened anywhere, no country, anywhere in Europe or in a developed country, they would want to relate with. Unfortunately, even when these development partners, the United States, the European Union, issued statements showing that indeed this is an illegitimate regime, they continue to pour money to extend foreign aid to Uganda. And that brings it to us that it is indeed being political, but not moral, not for what it's required, but of the people that are receiving the aid, but what is required.
I think Bobby is frozen. Tendai, can you see Bobby?
I can see him, but he's frozen. So I think it's probably the network issue in Kampala.
Maybe rather like I'll attempt to record a song.
They may have switched off the internet. They may have switched off the internet. Yeah.
Right, well, let me come back to you then, Tendai. Where in your experience when you were Minister of Finance in Zimbabwe was aid money well spent?
I think that aid does very well where the state has hit rock bottom and retreated. So when I got into government in 2009, there was total collapse. Hospitals were shut, clinics were shut, schools had been closed. Teachers had stopped going to school in July of 2007. So under that circumstance, the absorption capacity is very high because you are starting from very low. So we got a huge grant from the Global Fund, Geneva, that we used to pay for doctors, to pay for nurses, to provide for drugs. And of course, we put in money as our budget improved. We put money, I called it the especially vulnerable targeted areas. So we put in 2 million, I would save $2 million US, and I would put it in an institution. I started off with the Harare Hospital and then the Mupilo Hospital. I saw images of Harare hospitals on CNN, Kebule Mabusa, a South African journalist. I think Bob is back, and I couldn't believe it was Zimbabwe. So education and health, there was huge absorption. So those areas, aid tends to be effective, particularly when you hit photo. I think he's back.
Bobby, I don't know whether you're having the same network issues as we had when we tried to record the song, but just as a way of introduction, when Bobby and I met as a studio, one of his security guards was asked by a whole range of intelligence operatives that sit opposite his headquarters who I was. And one of them jokingly said, which unfortunately turned out to be rather disastrous in terms of trying to record the songs, that was Justin Bieber coming to record a song with Bobiwine. I have to say my kids all rolled their eyes virtually round in their head. But the net result of it was they turned the power off to the studio, and we had to spend half of our day going across different places. Wherever Bobby went, they turned the power off. Just a small, rather benign illustration of the difficulties of being an opposition figure in Uganda. Bobby, back to you.
Thank you very much, Greg. Apologies for the network glitch. It has become a norm for the internet to constantly be disrupted, as I'm always surrounded and I have operatives wherever. But I'll keep trying to maneuver so I keep connected. Please bear with me if I happen to keep being on and off. That is how it is here in Uganda. So I was still continuing my submission, or rather rant, about aid and how instead of being helpful is being detrimental. There is a tendency of not putting conditions, moral conditions that I believe are conscriptive of all of us as humanity, but most importantly, as the international community, for values like democracy, like respect for human rights, like respect for the rule of law, things that bring us together. And it has been a constant call, not just for us here in Uganda, but all over Africa, in countries that are ruled by authoritarian rulers, to make the respect of human rights and rule of law and preservation of democracy as preconditions for aid. But here is a situation, like I was giving a live example before I went off, that the COVID pandemic has had Uganda receive a lot of foreign aid. Of course, to help with the health care system, because we are battling a disease. Unfortunately, not a single new healthcare has been built. As a matter of fact, medical hospitals medical schools continue to be closed, while military and police schools are open. Thereby, international foreign aid being a helper and a facilitator for the tyrants, particularly here in Uganda, and also to the detriment of the people. Rights are being abused, sponsored by the donor funds. Citizens are being massacred, sponsored by donor funds, and the military and security agencies that are carrying out those atrocities are instead being helped and funded more. That explains why there was recently a protest by Ugandans trying to call upon the IMF not to just continue pouring aid, especially to an illegitimate regime in Uganda, a regime that was clearly pronounced, albeit technically, by the international community that it is illegitimate. And that's why, as I close, we feel very represented by your book, Dr. Greg Mills, Expensive Poverty. Our poverty is expensive because our poverty actually costs us. The money that is borrowed in our names, which is going to be paid by our children and our children's children, is actually being used to keep us poorer, to oppress us, to take away even the rights. Now they're taking away the resources, and the resources are helping them to come back again and take away the rights. So it is expensive 360. I thank you very much.
It's also expensive, Bobby, because, thank you very much. It's also expensive because you spend an awful lot of money and don't have much in the way of results in terms of incomes to show for it. Would you agree, before coming back to Tendai, that donors should calibrate their aid to spend more money on areas of success in democratic terms? I once, and this is in the book, had an argument with an American colonel in Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan when he was talking about spending money in the most insecure areas. I said, spend the money in the areas that are successful and reinforce success. Do you think that aid has done the wrong thing by trying to remedy failure when it should have been trying to reinforce success? In other words, making those countries, in this instance, more democratic, better functioning, giving them the reward, because we know that that is the substance of more complete and better functioning regimes. Would you agree that calibrating aid in a way that reinforced the success of democracy was a good way to go overall for donors?
That aid should be used to reinforce success, and where there is not been success, especially in terms of democracy and human rights, then there shouldn't be constantly money poured there, reinforcing success. I'll still ask a question. Is there interest to reinforce the success? Is there interest? Is the international community, is the donor community really looking at enforcing democracy, or it is rather to have the authoritarian rulers work to their interest, which I would not also disagree with, but which interests are at least not to the detriment of the rights and freedoms of the people that are purported to receive the donor aid. I will also be quick to add, Greg, that there is a misunderstanding, and a grave one, that the aid is helpful to the people. Looking in the context of Uganda, you will realize that after a long research, it has been discovered that those that are, every authoritarian regime builds a network of what the government officials here in Uganda love to call the mafia, which budgets for the donor money even before the donor money comes into the country. And as soon as the donor money gets in the country, it is already shared. I'll give an example of a current minister of security, JBMuwonge, who was indicted and indeed imprisoned for embezzling global fund money and the money that was used meant to help the victims of HIV/AIDS. He was later released and deployed by General Museveni as a minister. The same goes to JBMuwonge was the then Minister for Health, who got billions swindled, and therefore hundreds of thousands of people died because there was no, the money that was meant to help them was swindled. Same thing happened to another minister called Mike Mukula. Interestingly, all these ministers were just promoted. But not only that, look, for example, development funds that are brought in, and the regime, the highly placed people who are in office, ministers, permanent secretaries, name them, especially those that are connected to the regime, interestingly, in General Museveni's family, are pointed at to be the ones sharing the donor money to themselves. And like I said, there's a narrative that is put there, but there's a reality on ground, thereby agreeing with you further that aid, especially where it has worked, should be used to enforce successful areas. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks very much, Robbie. I'll come back to you before we close. Ten, I wanted to ask you about, since you were a finance minister in a country that had gone through an exceptionally long and bad patch, how would you characterize the difference from your experience in the chair between Western aid and Chinese aid? It's meant very different things to very many people, and I have